You know what's interesting about revolution? It rarely announces itself with trumpets and proclamations. Sometimes it starts with a few pencil lines on pine boards in a sawdust-filled shipyard, drawn by a man who's tired of watching good sailors die because their ships are too slow. 1794. Baltimore's Fells Point District. The corner of Washington and Aliciana Streets, where the smell of tar and fresh-cut timber mixed with the salt air coming off the Chesapeake. This is where Thomas Kemp, master shipwright, committed what the naval establishment would call professional suicide. Picture this. Kemp's drawing a hull that cuts down into the water at 45 degrees. 45 degrees. Traditional ships of the era? They curved gently at maybe 20 degrees, like a spoon easing into soup. Kemp's design was a knife going straight down into an apple. And that wasn't even the crazy part. The masts. Oh, the masts. He's got them raking backward at angles that made every British naval officer who saw them break into laughter. I mean, think about it from their perspective. You've got centuries of shipbuilding tradition, generations of knowledge passed from master to apprentice, and here's this American colonial drawing ships that look like they're permanently leaning back in a strong wind. Surely, they thought, surely the first real storm would snap those masts like twigs or flip the whole vessel over. And the proportions? The length stretched to nearly 4 times the beam width. 4-to-1. Traditional stable shipbuilding wisdom said that was madness. Every principle passed down through the centuries screamed that such a vessel would crack in half or twist apart in heavy seas. The mockery came fast, and it came hard. British Admiral Lord Gardner, when he got his hands on some captured American merchant vessels in 1795, didn't mince words. He called these sharp-built experiments desperate follies of colonial amateurs who confuse speed with seaworthiness. And Gardner wasn't alone. French naval architects visiting Baltimore took one look at Kemp's designs and dismissed them as dancing masters rather than fighting ships. Even American merchants, the very people who needed these vessels, were hesitant. They knew their reliable cargo haulers. They'd bet their fortunes and their lives on traditional designs. Why risk everything on these untested knife blades? But here's the thing about necessity. It has this way of making the impossible suddenly seem worth trying. Between 1793 and 1797, American merchants lost $40 million in ships and cargo to British seizures. $40 million. In 1793 money, to put that in perspective, that was more than the entire federal budget of the United States at the time. And if you think that's bad, consider this. Insurance rates for traditional vessels trying to sail to French ports hit 60% of the Bata cargo's value. 60%! You're paying more than half the value of your goods just for the privilege of maybe getting them to market. In waterfront taverns from Boston to Charleston, you'd hear the same stories over and over. Captains nursing their rum, talking in low voices about watching British frigates bear down on their merchantmen, about how you could see them coming for hours. These massive warships with their gun decks and their crews of hundreds. You could see them coming, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. Your sluggish, reliable, traditional merchant vessel couldn't outrun them, couldn't outmaneuver them. You just had to sit there and watch your livelihood, maybe your life, sailing toward you with British colours flying. Speed wasn't just an advantage. Speed was survival, and survival meant everything. The first vindication, the moment when the impossible became undeniable, came with a schooner called Vigilant. Built in 1794 with Kemp's radical lines, she encountered 3 British warships off the Virginia Capes. 3 warships, and she outran them, all 3, left them wallowing in her wake like bathtubs trying to chase a thoroughbred. Word spread through the maritime communities like wildfire. Faster than any traditional ship could sail, ironically enough. Suddenly, these impossible designs weren't so impossible after all. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because it wasn't just Thomas Kemp working alone in his shipyard. Innovation rarely happens in isolation. There was Anders Linders, a Swedish shipwright who brought with him generations of Scandinavian boat-building knowledge. Working right alongside him, Samuel Hopkins, a freed slave and craftsman who understood wood in ways that defied formal training. Together, They perfected the technique of steam-bending oak planks to achieve those extreme curves that everyone said couldn't be done. They were literally bending the rules along with the wood. Then you had Jan van der Berg, a Dutch sailmaker, who wasn't content to just copy what had always been done. He developed this revolutionary sail plan with square topsails that could catch wind at heights where traditional vessels found nothing but dead air. Think about that. While other ships were limited to the wind at sea level, Van der Berg's sails were grabbing power from 50-60 feet up, where the air moved faster and more consistently. This was a multicultural revolution happening in real time, right there in Baltimore. Swedish techniques, African craftsmanship, Dutch sail-making expertise, American innovation, all coming together to create something entirely new. Each tradition contributed something essential. Take away any one of those elements and you don't get the Baltimore Clipper. You get another failed experiment. The establishment said it was impossible. The experts said it violated every principle of sound shipbuilding. The naval architects said these vessels would break apart or capsize or simply fail in any meaningful way. And then Vigilant outran 3 British warships. Suddenly, impossible didn't seem like quite the right word anymore. But here's what nobody realized yet. Standing there in 1794 watching these strange knife-blade ships take to the water, nobody understood that they weren't just creating a faster merchant vessel. They were creating a weapon that would, in less than 20 years, bring the British Empire to its knees and force the most powerful navy in the world to completely rethink everything it knew about maritime warfare. And it all started with a few pencil lines that everyone said were wrong. So let's jump ahead 18 years. The War of 1812 is raging, and those laughable Baltimore Clippers, they're about to become the stuff of British nightmares. July 14th, 1814. Captain Thomas Boyle is standing on the deck of his Baltimore-built clipper, the Chasseur, and he's about to do something so audacious, so spectacularly bold, that when you first hear it, you think it has to be a legend. But it's not. It's documented. It happened. Boyle dictated a proclamation declaring the entire British Isles under naval blockade. The entire British Isles, by his single ship, one vessel, against the British Empire, against the most powerful navy the world had ever seen, with hundreds of warships, thousands of cannon, tens of thousands of sailors. And here's the best part. He had this proclamation nailed to the door of Lloyd's Coffee House in London. Lloyd's Coffee House, for those who don't know, was the heart of British maritime insurance, the place where ship owners and merchants gathered to do business, to assess risk, to determine the fate of fortunes. Imagine walking up to that door one morning, ready to conduct your business as usual, and there it is. An official-looking proclamation from an American privateer captain declaring that you, the British Empire, are now blockaded. By one ship, the insurance rates went into absolute panic, and you have to appreciate the psychological warfare of it all. Boyle wasn't just attacking ships. He was attacking confidence, attacking the sense of invulnerability that came with being the British Empire. Now, you might be thinking this was all bluster, all show. But Chasseur backed it up. She was built by Thomas Kemp in 1812, representing everything those initial mockeries had led to. 2 decades of refinement, of learning, of perfecting. She carried 16 guns and could ghost through the water at 14 knots when British frigates were struggling to make 8. 14 knots. That's the difference between a modern car and a bicycle. That's the difference between catching your prey and watching it disappear over the horizon. That's the difference between life and death. Her crew numbered 115 men. And here's where it gets interesting, from a social perspective. These men operated under articles of agreement that guaranteed equal shares of prize money. Think about what that means. This wasn't the British Navy with its rigid hierarchy, where captains got the lion's share and common sailors got scraps. This was a floating democracy where merit mattered more than birthright, where performance counted more than pedigree. The ship even had a musician, Jupiter Wells, an escaped slave who composed ballads during calm nights. Can you picture this? Between battles, between prizes, during those long stretches at sea, Wells would create songs that captured what they were doing, who they were. And these ballads spread through every port the chasseur visited, spreading the legend of Baltimore's clippers from the Caribbean to the Irish Sea. The statistics from this period, and I need you to really hear these numbers because they're staggering, tell a story that the British Admiralty desperately wanted to suppress. Between 1812 and 1815, Baltimore clippers captured or destroyed 517 British vessels. 517. These weren't all massive warships, to be fair. Many were merchants, transports, supply vessels. But that's exactly the point. The Baltimore clippers were strangling British commerce, cutting the arteries that kept the empire functioning. There was this one privateer, the tiny Prince de Neufchâtel. Tiny. And she fought off boats from HMS Endymion carrying 5 times her number of men. 5 times. The British sent overwhelming force. By any reasonable calculation, they should have taken her easily, and she beat them back. The Comet took 21 prizes in a single cruise, 21 vessels, 1 voyage. And the British Admiralty, this institution that had dominated the world's oceans for generations, was forced to recall 74 warships from European waters. 74 warships that were needed in the fight against Napoleon, pulled back to protect home shipping from American privateers. The strategic implications of that are enormous. Napoleon was the existential threat to Britain at that moment, and they had to divert resources to deal with Baltimore clippers. But here's what really tells you the story. The British secretly ordered their naval architects to study captured Baltimore clippers. Secretly. The same designs they'd mocked as impossible, as amateur follies, they were now desperately trying to understand. There are drawings of the captured Nonpareil, taken in 1807, with annotations in Admiral Cochrane's own hand. Cochrane, who commanded British naval forces in the Americas, his words, "Study this design. Our future depends on understanding it." Read that again. Our future depends on understanding it. That's not just an admission of respect. That's an acknowledgement of revolution. Now, while navies were adapting, there was another group paying very close attention. Pirates. And when I say pirates, I mean the real deal. Caribbean pirates, the kind who made their living outside any nation's law. Jean Lafitte, perhaps the most famous pirate of the era, abandoned his traditional brigantine for a Baltimore-built schooner in 1813. Lafitte wasn't sentimental about ships. He used what worked, and what worked was Baltimore design. You even had female pirates getting in on this. Anne Bonny and Mary Red, sailing aboard the Calico Jack's Revenge, a vessel built on Baltimore lines. These women were challenging not just naval conventions but the entire gender structure of their society, and they were doing it aboard ships that embodied revolutionary thinking. What appealed to pirates wasn't just the speed, though that certainly helped when you're running from naval patrols. It was the culture. That democratic shipboard system, with profit sharing and elected officers, aligned perfectly with pirate philosophy. Pirates had rejected traditional authority, and here were ships built by a culture that had done the same thing. By 1815, nearly 70% of known pirate vessels in the Caribbean followed Baltimore design principles. 70%. The revolution had spread beyond its original purpose. But we need to talk about the human cost, because no story about war and privateering is complete without acknowledging what it meant for the families left behind. Every launching from Fells Point meant sons and fathers sailing into danger. They might return wealthy. They might not return at all. Sarah Kemp, Thomas's wife, managed the shipyard's books and correspondence while her husband was at sea testing new designs. She wasn't just keeping the home fires burning. She was running a business, managing craftsmen, handling contracts. On December 24th, 1814, she wrote in her diary, and these words have stayed with me. "The British burned Washington, but they cannot burn the knowledge in our heads and hands. Every plank we bend is rebellion. Every sail we cut is defiance. Every plank we bend is rebellion." That's not just about shipbuilding. That's about national identity. That's about proving that the experts can be wrong, that revolution can come from places the establishment never expects. The Baltimore Clipper had gone from impossible joke to weapon of war, from mocked experiment to copied masterpiece. But the story doesn't end with triumph and vindication, because what happens when your revolutionary design gets so good that everyone wants it? What happens when the thing you created for freedom gets used for something else entirely? What happens when your beautiful, fast, perfect ships become instruments of the slave trade? That's where this story takes its darkest turn. Irony has a way of being sharp, doesn't it? Sometimes history twists back on itself in ways that make you question everything you thought you understood about progress and morality. 1815. The war ends, and the British Navy, the same institution that had mocked Baltimore clippers as unstable gun platforms, as dancing masters, as desperate follies, is now desperately seeking to acquire them. But not for war, for something that should have been noble but was tangled up in its own contradictions. Anti-slavery patrols off West Africa. Let me tell you about HMS Black Joke. Originally, she was a Baltimore-built slaver, built with those same revolutionary lines, that same incredible speed, specifically designed to outrun naval patrols while carrying human beings in chains. The Royal Navy captured her in 1827, and here's where it gets complicated. During her service with the British, the Black Joke freed over 3,000 enslaved people. 3,000 people, real human beings who would have spent their lives, or what remained of their lives, in bondage, freed by a ship that was designed to enslave them. The irony cuts so deep you could bleed on it. Vessels designed in the cause of American freedom, built by a nation that had just fought a war against tyranny, now serving British humanitarian goals while their sister ships carried human cargo in conditions that defy description. Because that's the brutal economic reality that drove this transformation. A single successful slave voyage in a Baltimore clipper could yield $300,000 in profit. $300,000. That was enough to offset 10 vessels lost to patrol ships and still come out ahead. The mathematics of human suffering are cold and precise. The Spanish government paid American shipbuilders double the normal rate to produce clippers for Caribbean patrol duty. They needed speed to catch slavers, the same speed that made slavers so effective. French privateers offered Baltimore craftsmen salaries 5 times local wages to relocate to Martinique and build ships. Everyone wanted what Baltimore had created. The design that Britain called impossible had become the most copied naval architecture in maritime history. And the influence kept spreading, like ripples from a stone thrown in a pond, reaching shores that Thomas Kemp probably never imagined when he drew those first radical lines. Danish merchants used Baltimore clippers to establish the fastest mail service in the Caribbean. And remember that original Vigilant? The ship that first proved everyone wrong by outrunning 3 British warships? She kept sailing. Year after year, decade after decade. 134 years of continuous service until a hurricane finally claimed her in 1928. 134 years. Most wooden ships of that era were lucky to last 20 or 30 years before they rotted out or broke apart. The Vigilant sailed through the entire 19th century and a quarter of the 20th. Brazilian pirates terrorized Portuguese shipping with Baltimore-pattern vessels built in hidden jungle shipyards. Think about that. Deep in the Amazon basin, shipwrights who had never seen Baltimore or the Chesapeake were building copies of copies, adapting the design to local materials, to tropical conditions, to their own needs. Even Chinese pirates in the South China Sea got hold of captured plans and built their own interpretations. They put traditional junk sails on Baltimore hulls, creating these hybrid vessels that combined 2 completely different maritime traditions. The design had literally circled the globe. But back in Baltimore, this spread wasn't cause for celebration. It was cause for torment. Thomas Kemp refused all contracts for slave ships, refused them outright. He'd created these vessels as instruments of freedom, of American independence, of breaking British control. To see them used for slavery violated everything he'd intended. But here's the thing about innovation. Once you release it into the world, you can't control it. You can't put those ideas back in the box. His nephew wrote to him from Charleston in 1832. And this letter survived, preserved in family archives. The words are damning. "Uncle, your beautiful ships have become instruments of evil. The Diligente, built on your plans, carried 600 souls in conditions that would shame the devil himself." 600 people, in a ship designed to carry maybe a tenth of that as crew and cargo, packed in holds in conditions that, you're right, would shame the devil. And built on Kemp's plans, Baltimore's Quaker community, which had always been a strong voice for abolition, led boycotts against shipyards building vessels for the slave trade. These weren't symbolic protests. These were economic campaigns designed to hurt the builders where it counted, and it created deep divisions in the maritime community. The same community that had united so beautifully against British oppression during the war was now fracturing along moral lines over what their creations were being used for. Imagine being shipwright in Fells Point in 1830. You've got the British wanting your ships for anti-slavery patrol. You've got Spanish and Brazilian merchants offering incredible money for ships that will carry slaves. You've got pirates wanting your design. You've got legitimate merchants wanting fast cargo carriers. Every group wants the same basic vessel, but for completely different purposes. How do you navigate that morally? But here's what's fascinating from a purely technical standpoint, setting aside the moral complexity for a moment. The cultural exchange accelerated through these vessels. Baltimore clippers brought back navigation instruments from China that were more sophisticated than anything European or American navigators were using. They brought rope-making techniques from Africa that produced stronger, more flexible cordage. They brought food preservation methods from Pacific islands that extended voyage ranges. Each innovation, no matter where it came from, was incorporated into the next generation of designs. These ships were becoming truly global in their DNA. The Baltimore Maritime Exchange, established in 1820, became an international clearinghouse for shipbuilding knowledge. You had visitors from Sweden, from Japan, from South America, all coming to Baltimore to learn and share techniques. It's this incredible contradiction. Ships being used for one of humanity's greatest evils were simultaneously serving as vehicles for human knowledge and cultural exchange. How do you reconcile that? How do you hold both truths in your head at the same time? The answer is, you probably can't. Not comfortably, anyway. History isn't comfortable. It doesn't resolve itself into simple narratives of good and evil, of progress and decline. Sometimes the same innovation that represents human ingenuity at its finest also enables human cruelty at its worst. Thomas Kemp died in 1824. He lived long enough to see his designs spread worldwide, to see them vindicate his vision, to see the British Admiralty copy what they'd once mocked. But he also lived long enough to see them twisted into purposes he'd never intended, serving causes he despised. The revolution he started couldn't be stopped. For better and for worse, the Baltimore Clipper had changed the world. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because these radical designs, these impossible knife-blade ships, were about to spawn something even bigger. So, here's where we connect the dots, from 1794 to today. Because the Baltimore Clipper's story doesn't end with the Age of Sail, it echoes forward through time in ways that would have amazed Thomas Kemp. Those revolutionary principles, those impossible angles and radical proportions that made British admirals laugh, spawned the golden age of sail. We're talking about the massive China clippers, ships that could carry thousands of tons of cargo at speeds that steamships wouldn't match for decades. Donald Mackay. Remember that name. He learned his craft studying Baltimore designs, absorbing those principles, understanding why they worked. In 1854, he built the Lightning, and the Lightning set a speed record that stood for 130 years. 130 years. Think about everything that happened in those 13 decades. The Civil War, 2 world wars, the Depression, the Space Age. And through all of that, Mackay's ship held the record. The evolution from 100-ton Baltimore privateers to 2,000-ton China clippers traces directly back to Thomas Kemp's drawings. It's a straight line of innovation, each generation building on the last, making the vessels bigger, faster, more capable. But the fundamental principles? Those came from Fells Point. Now let's jump to 1977. Modern Baltimore. The city decides to build a replica, a working reproduction of a Baltimore Clipper to serve as the city's ambassador. They called her Pride of Baltimore, and she sailed 150,000 miles. 150,000 miles. She visited ports around the world, reminding people of this incredible maritime heritage, of what American innovation had achieved. But here's the thing about these ships. They demand respect. They're not museum pieces that you can sail casually. They're the same radical, powerful, dangerous vessels they always were. May 14, 1986. A white squall, one of those sudden, violent storms that come out of nowhere in tropical waters, caught Pride of Baltimore north of Puerto Rico. Captain Armin Elsesser, who went by Miles, and 3 crew members were lost. 4 people died doing what generations of Baltimore Clipper sailors had done, pushing these vessels to their limits, sailing them the way they were meant to be sailed. The tragedy reminded the world that these ships weren't romantic artifacts. They were serious machines that required serious respect. The ocean doesn't care about your historical authenticity or your educational mission. It only cares about whether you understand what you're doing. But Baltimore didn't give up. In 1988, they launched Pride of Baltimore 2, this time incorporating modern safety features while maintaining historical authenticity. It's still sailing today, still serving as an ambassador, still teaching people about this incredible chapter of maritime history, but doing it with the lessons of 1986 built into every voyage. And here's what's really fascinating. The influence of Baltimore Clippers reaches into the 21st century in ways you might not expect. Modern America's Cup racing yachts, the most advanced sailing vessels in the world, use hull designs that echo Baltimore's sharp-built principles. Naval architects, working with composite materials and computer modeling, still come back to those fundamental insights about how a hull should move through water. The angles are there, the proportions are there. Refined, updated, built with carbon fiber instead of oak, but the DNA is Baltimore. Coast Guard fast response cutters, the modern vessels that patrol American waters, employ weight distribution patterns first perfected in 1800. The knowledge that Samuel Hopkins and Anders Linders developed, bending oak planks in Thomas Kemp's shipyard, informs how we build aluminum patrol boats 2 centuries later. There are even naval architects studying stealth technology, who reference Baltimore Clipper's ability to slice through water with minimal disturbance. When you're trying to design a ship that doesn't create a large radar signature, you look at vessels that moved through their medium efficiently, quietly, with minimal energy waste. The Baltimore Clipper did that naturally, by design, because that's what you need when you're trying to outrun British frigates. The impossible design had become fundamental to maritime engineering, not just influential. Fundamental. But knowledge is fragile. It can be lost. So there are people working to make sure that doesn't happen. The Fells Point Maritime Museum maintains Thomas Kemp's original drawings in climate-controlled archives. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're working documents that modern shipwrights still reference. The precision of those hand-drawn lines, the calculations done without computers, the understanding of forces and materials that Kemp had in his head. It's all there on paper, preserved for future generations. Willis McKean, master shipwright, whose ancestors actually worked in Kemp's yard, teaches traditional construction techniques to apprentices from around the world. These aren't historical reenactors playing dress-up. These are serious craftspeople learning skills that took generations to develop. Steam bending techniques, wood selection, the feel of how a plank wants to curve, knowledge that can't be fully captured in books or videos, that has to be passed hand to hand, master to apprentice. Every year, the Baltimore Clipper Festival brings together wooden boat builders, historians, sailing enthusiasts. They're not just celebrating the past, they're actively continuing the tradition, building new vessels, sharing techniques, keeping the knowledge alive and evolving. Living history programs allow students to experience life aboard these revolutionary vessels. And that's important, because reading about something in a book and actually doing it are completely different forms of understanding. When you're hauling on lines, adjusting sails, feeling how the ship responds to wind and water, you understand in your body why these designs worked, why speed mattered more than size. The final vindication, and I love this, comes from an unexpected source. The British National Maritime Museum, the institution that represents the Navy that once mocked these designs, has a permanent exhibition on naval innovation, and at the center of that exhibition is a Baltimore Clipper model. The placard reads, "The design we once mocked as impossible became the foundation of maritime supremacy. The Baltimore Clipper proved that revolution comes not from perfecting old ideas, but from risking everything on new ones." Below the model sits Thomas Kemp's compass, donated by his descendants, his actual compass, the instrument he used while designing and testing these revolutionary vessels. And according to the museum staff, the needle still works. It still points toward magnetic north. But in a metaphorical sense, maybe it's pointing toward something else. Toward uncharted waters, toward the courage to risk everything on an idea that everyone says is impossible, toward the understanding that revolution comes from the margins, not the center, that sometimes the experts are wrong and the amateurs are right. That necessity drives innovation in ways that comfort never can. Thomas Kemp stood in a sawdust-filled shipyard in 1794 and drew lines that violated every principle of sound shipbuilding. The experts laughed. The establishment mocked. The naval architects dismissed him as an amateur playing with forces he didn't understand. And he changed the world. That's the power of impossible ideas. That's what happens when you risk everything on something new. That's the legacy of the Baltimore Clipper, sailing forward through time, its influence still cutting through the waters of progress like a knife through the waves. The impossible became inevitable, and the revolution that started at the corner of Washington and Alliciana Streets continues today, in every vessel that dares to challenge what everyone knows is true. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible is simply the possible waiting for someone brave enough to try.